Hey everyone, this is Krish. Hope you're doing fine. In this video, let's talk a little bit about code quality, right? And then why it's important to write code. I mean, it's obvious that we should write good code, but what does it mean? And what are the repercussions of actually not writing the best code that you could possibly write? So I was having a conversation with someone the other day, um, and it was a casual conversation, and I was talking about coding and code quality and how code might have to be written. She wasn't a developer, or she isn't a developer, so her immediate reaction, even if in lighter vein, was, "What's the difference? I thought all code was equal, right?" So we had a laugh, and then just talked a little bit more about why all code is not equal, right? It's obvious, but why is it not equal? And what makes one more expensive in the shorter and longer run than the other? Um, of course, the better code you write, the easier it is for you to identify bugs so you could fix them when one is reported. Or even better, the better code you write, the fewer bugs you're going to introduce into your application. Whether it's a new app that you're building or whether there is an existing one that you're contributing to in terms of adding new features. If it's a UI app, maybe new UI pages, new components, new sections within existing pages, or if it's an API heavy app, then you're adding more APIs. And as you introduce a new one or make changes to an existing one, you don't end up inadvertently breaking some other API. I mean, regardless of the test suites that you might run, the test coverage is going to be, if it's more than a certain percentage, it's great, but it's not always the case. So the less you have to rely on tests to catch your issues, the slightly better off you might be, right? So how can you? What are some of the things you could possibly do to write good code? Some basic practices, right? I mean, if you're depending on the language and the stack, you can go look up online to see what the recommended design patterns are, the coding conventions, the naming conventions for variables and classes and modules and mixins and whatnot. But outside of that, there are some obvious things which are stack agnostic that you could do. Say, for instance, how you name your files, right? I've seen places where the files are not named, so they become intuitive enough or obvious enough to you. So before you actually open up a file and look at the name of the class or the module or the interface, I think the name itself should be reasonably intuitive. Some languages mandate that you have certain names driven by the class names, for instance, but that's not necessarily the case in a variety of frameworks. So you want to make sure that your words are complete, they are meaningful, and you not try to reinvent acronyms for words that people are used to. Now that you've named them well enough, you open up the file, you talk about code documentation, right? Whether it's Ruby doc or Java doc, or you're running YARD, or any of these other documentation libraries to generate your code documentation. They pick up a certain syntax that you have, your module level comments or method level or class level comments. But I think you want to document something that's not obvious by looking at the code. The documentation should aid your code, because let's say there's a method that returns a list of restaurants. It's going to be called, say, get restaurants. There's no point adding a line of code that says, hey, this method returns restaurants, or this class deals with restaurants, because that's going to be obvious enough by the time you get there. So try not to document the obvious, because you're just going to use up space and real estate in that file, and it's not going to add much value, right? So you want to document your params, the arguments that are coming into the method, and the variations as to what the different values might be. Use some examples, and try not to state the obvious, because you want to use that, literally those two lines, to say something more meaningful to the reader of your code. And then when you add log statements and debug, again, that can replace a code comment, right? Because if I'm adding a log that says, here's what happened when someone made a request for restaurant ID 12345, then that is an implicit code comment. Because I've also seen occasions where folks sometimes add a code level comment, and there's one more log or a debug statement, and they're not very different from each other, right? So there's, again, not a whole lot of value there. So some of those items, and try to keep your methods small enough, right? Try to follow the rule of 30, which is like your method shouldn't be any longer than like 30 lines, for instance. Even that I think is a little too many. So keep them as small as possible. And make sure if you're adding methods code that shouldn't be accessible to other classes, obviously you want to respect the security in terms of making it private or protected. But if you're writing code in Ruby, obviously you can get past those. So I actually prefer to use lambdas, which makes it even more encapsulated than the private methods in Ruby, for instance, right? So those are some of the things I can think of, but ultimately the way you want to look at your code is, hey, if I'm looking at this tomorrow or a week later or a month later, will I understand this not by virtue of the knowledge I have because I wrote that code, but by simply looking at how the code is written or how it talks to you. You want to make sure that you don't have to make an extra effort of understanding what that does. If you have to, then clearly you want to either consider rewriting it so it makes it more obvious, or adding, improving it with documentation or log statements, or a combination of those factors, right? So you want to make sure whatever you write is understandable not just to you uh, primarily, right? But it should also be easily understood by anyone else looking at it with or without prior knowledge of your system. And if you did that, making further code changes and making improvements is going to become a whole lot easier. And someone who comes after you and looking at your code is hopefully not going to be able to complain as well that, hey, you know what, I don't understand what this thing does. So yeah, those just some thoughts. Hopefully that helps. Thanks.